participated in many different conferences over the years, and his wife is here with him, who hasn't been here for quite a few years now, I think. But it's so delightful to see you here as well. And I might add, I just think it is important to know that his daughters might have been here. They actually were finalists for scholars, and but they had to turn us down at the last minute because they had some really interesting things that came up in their lives that just prevented them from being here too. So we almost have the whole family tonight. But he's a professor emeritus in environmental ethics at the University of Waterloo, and still currently serves as a professor at the University of Toronto. And his work tonight is based on the Matters of Life and Death, Reflections on Bioethics, Law, and Human Destiny. It's a book, a copy of which he brought here last year, and I actually was able to get one of them from him, and it's a very fine publication, and I think you'll see plenty of pieces of that tonight, and hopefully we'll start a new level of conversation about the whole question of biopiracy and what do you do with regard to the seed material that you get from other societies, and how do you respect that, and can you respect it, and who owns it, and should it be up for grabs, or should it be up for, or do the current owners own it, or do their ancestors own it, and etc. But I'm sure he'll be talking a lot about these, and the whole question in India of food. And this is a big part of the universe that we're talking about. So please come up and address us.
What's interesting about the slide, the picture, the baby in the pram here is not from India or from Africa. He's probably from the United States. And certainly the parents looks like quite tired out. So when I came to Canada at the age of 21, many years ago, I was quite surprised at many gatherings for dinner at friends' house, that the parents would often tell their children to finish the food on the plate because there are a lot of hungry children in India. And I heard it again and again over many years. And when I became a parent myself, I found myself saying the same things. We have two girls who are now 21 and 24, and they were brought up in Canada, and really indeed we impressed upon them. There are a lot of hungry people in India. India, in the popular imagination of the West, indeed all over the world, for decades and if not for centuries, has become a symbol of poverty, overpopulation, and hunger. I want to make a few comments about it, because I feel there is a lot of misunderstanding. There are three things I will cover in this presentation. One is, of course, intellectual property rights. What is intellectual and what is property, and whose rights? And the second thing I'll cover is what is traditional knowledge, what we consider knowledge to be, and what is traditional knowledge. And then I'll talk about biopiracy. These are hot issues in many parts of the world. They certainly are very hot issues in India. It so happens for the last 3 years I've been a visiting professor in India, so I have seen things from the ground up, which I couldn't do when I was living in Canada. So I would say I've gotten some exposure to things which are not always available to us scholars if we depend solely or exclusively or largely on what we see written in papers. So, let me say this again. Okay. I don't mean to provoke anyone. Just a few pictures. All right. So, let's start with India. India, food, population, and hunger. I show you a picture here of bread, roti, or chapati. Mahatma Gandhi once said that for a hungry man, roti is his God. And Gandhi, of course, unlike many other leaders in India in the 20s and 30s, he saw and he made a point of seeing poverty from close quarters, so that he had a sense of India, and not just, again, political overthrow of the British, but a sense of what's going on in the country, because he wanted to see that a change comes from the ground up. And indeed, his contribution to the country is really, he was a saint in politics, in the sense that he was not trying to grab power, but trying to see how he can be a real force for change. So I want to take these three things about food, population, and hunger. Now, India at present, the census, last year's census of 2011, India has 1,200 million people, 1.2 billion people. That's a lot of people. And really, even 1% people in India means 12 million people. The population of Canada is about 30 million. So in India, there are 40 Canadas. And there are 4 United States. And there are many Britons. So every country is really quite dwarfs before India. So not only the number of people, but the complexity of the country is equally large, it's huge. The number of languages, the cultural patterns, the food patterns, everything is multiple. It's 10 times, 20 times, 30 times. So it makes it a very complex country. That shouldn't act as an excuse for the country's sometimes mismanagement or corruption, but nevertheless needs to be kept in mind. But when I talk to people, my students in Canada, I often remind them that if we are so bothered about certain things going on in the City Hall in Toronto or in the province of Ontario, remember there are 40 Canadas in India. And so what does it mean? You know, how does it work out? So another thing, about India, 50% of the workforce in India is engaged in farming. 50% of the workforce in India is engaged in farming. We sometimes forget it, that the workforce in Canada engaged in farming is under 2%. And there is no country in the West, including Greece or Spain or Italy, where the workforce in farming is anything more than 10%. This change has come about in the last 100 years. About 100 years ago, again, about 50–60% people in the West was equally engaged in farming. That change has come about. And now India is at the cusp of change, big change. And some people are scared about it. Some people look at it with great hope that something remarkable is going to happen. But certainly it is true that India is at the cusp of change, big change, particularly in the last 2 decades, since 1990. So, what's also important to remember, that about these 1,200 million people, there are 600,000 villages in India. 600,000 villages. So until fairly recently, about 75% of the population in India lived in villages, of population of less than 2,000. And many of these villages were truly cut off from the rest of the country. There were hardly any roads, very little electricity, hardly any telephones, and very little transportation of any kind, and very few schools. So in a way, those people, rural people, were cut off from the rest of the country. I remember myself as a young boy seeing my father, who was a lawyer. The people came from the rural part as clients, and I would often ask my father, what is the dispute that they're bringing? He said, the disputes are always about land. It's always about land. He said 95% of the disputes in the villages were about land, between brothers, cousins, sons, fathers, and so on. So I'm going to talk about that, why land is so important. Now, India's population growth in this last census of 2011 shows that the population growth has gone down. It's gone down. This is the good news. It's gone down. Not very hugely, but gone down nevertheless. And what is important, that there is a rising middle class in the country. Now, there are some people who have made certain observations about India's population this time, this conference, and also last year. And I have a slightly different take on it, if I may present it to you. India's population has gone down, not because people feel guilty by producing more people. Nowhere in the world, population has gone down, including USA, or Canada, or Italy, or Spain, because people suddenly feel that morally it is not a good thing to produce more children. That's not what makes people want to have fewer families. Until the end of the 19th century, people everywhere, the population rates were more or less the same. Whether this in Asia, or Africa, or in Europe, the differences were very little. So much so that in the famous book written by Malthus in 1798 on principle of an essay on population, that was read by many distinguished people in Victorian age, in 19th century. But it did not make very much dent on the population. In 1801, the first census conducted in England, the population of England at that time, soon after Malthus's book, the population of England at that time was 8 million. By the end of the century, 100 years later, it was 30 million. 4 times, 400% increase. During the same period, in that century, during the same period, literally millions of English people, or British people, had left the country and gone to Canada, come to USA, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia, and so on and so on. So the large number of people had moved out of the country. In addition, in the 19th century, a lot of children, orphan children from England, were shipped off to Canada and New Zealand and Australia. These were orphan children. There were 150,000 of them were sent to Canada. These were kids between the age of 4 and 12. They were called home children. And they were to be paid $1 a year in Canada. And they were treated very badly. Now there is recently the Prime Minister of Canada and the Prime Minister of Britain expressed apologies for it. The home children. So there is a huge change that went on from that period, from 1801 to 1900, at the end of the century. I often remind my students that the great Charles Darwin, who had read Malthus very well, and who had used some of his theories in formulating his ideas, he had 10 children. Only one of them died young. Then, the other great man of the 19th century Victorian England was Charles Dickens. He too had 10 children. None of them died early. The other man, very important figure of Victorian England, who spent the last half of his time in England, was Karl Marx. He had 7 children. 3 of them died of hunger. So what I'm trying to say to you, that really during all of the 19th century, the population of England, as indeed of Europe, there was very little dent, very little change. But I'll give you an example of a country, of a place in Canada, which also had huge population sizes and population birth rate, and that is the province of Quebec. I know there is a fellow here from Quebec, so I hope I present my figures correctly here. Till 1940s, the population, the average family size in Quebec was 8 to 10 children. It's a Catholic part of the country. It was also poor, also felt very oppressed by the English part of Canada. But there was a quiet revolution that occurred in Quebec in 1950s and 60s. And now Quebec has the lowest birth rate has among us the lowest birth rate in the whole world. So much so that now they have been given extra money to produce the first child and second child, $5,000 award. And most mothers say, you keep it. It's not enough to buy diapers for the year. And one wonders, how did this change come about? It's not that they were suddenly feeling a certain embarrassment, a positive, constructive embarrassment about moral issues. No, there are very strong factors that change the lives of women. It's the lives of women, and those lives change, that's where the birth rate changes. Firstly, Canada had introduced in late 50s, early 60s, a universal health care. That made a big dent. That means it doesn't matter if you're poor or rich, you have universal health care in the country, which is the pride and joy of Canada even now. Secondly, there was a great opportunities for women to go to colleges, universities and schools. So much so, in 1950s, there were no more than 7% of the population of universities, were 7% were women. Today, more than 60% students are women in almost all universities across the country. Big change. Thirdly, there is a very slow infant mortality. Infant mortality has gone down very, very substantially in Canada, as indeed in most Western countries, including Japan. It is now 4 or 5. And that makes a big difference. And plus, the equity in wages for women, opportunities for women. These are the factors that have contributed to really birth rate. I feel there's so much effort in trying to make various birth control things to women in India, as indeed are misdirected. What needs to be done is to change the lives of women. That will make it possible to decrease the population rates in the country, as that has happened in the urban centers in India. Urban centers in India, now we find rarely women or families have more than 2 children. It's a big change, huge change. Now, this is the kind of change that we see in two parts of, particularly in the state of Kerala in India, in the southern state. So many people don't know that is the first state in the world to have elected a Marxist government in 1950s. And it also has a substantial Catholic Christian presence in the country. So what has happened over the decades, over the last 5-6 decades, is that it introduced many things that have contributed to the well-being and welfare of women. That has, and now Kerala has the lowest birth rate in the whole country. So I feel that when we talk about population, we think India is a problem. No, India also looks at their children. I often say, if I were a poor person in India, it would be foolish of me to have a small family. Because unless there is a welfare system which is going to take care of me in my old age, if I'm unemployed, if I'm sick, if there is no life insurance, and so on, which middle class has, that it will be foolish to have a small family, small size of family. So we should not look, nor do people look at their children saying, a child is born, it's a burden. No, a child is also an asset. If a child can survive the first 3 to 5 years, he or she is an asset. He'll work, she will work. She has hands, he has hands. He has brains, he'll do things. Unlike many of us oldies who are not going to do many things. Truly, people look at their children, and as they must, as countries do. Japan's population is going down, as population in Italy is going down, and it's a matter of concern. Can people maintain their standard of living as they did before? Because there's not enough population to work. A lot of old people, but not enough people to really will contribute and in a productive way. Now, what's remarkable about India's population? Something to be remembered. The median age in India is 25. 20 means half the population is below 25 and half the population is above 25. That's a remarkable thing for India, and it could be India could be one of the most important powers and economic powers in the world because of this. Because the average age, the median age in Canada, USA is close to 40. And it is so in Japan, it is so in most of Europe, whereas it means more older people. Now I know we are all older people here, but really older people are a burden of the society rather than an asset for the society, because we take away resources rather than contribute to it. When you have a country like India with 25 median age, means a lot of young people. Only if they would have better education, more education, only if they could have better political leadership, they could do wonders for the country. So I look at it with great optimism, and yet, of course, with certain degree of concern. Now, let's go back here. As I said, human population, of course, has increased dramatically in the last 100 years, from about 1.7 billion to over 7 billion. That's over 400% increase. But that's the kind of increase that we saw in Europe, 400%, in England and other countries as well. Now, we sometimes don't want to look at things that happen in the history. History we think is only to be taught and write about, but history is sometimes a living force in the life of a country. And I know I don't mean to say anything negative to my friends from the Raj, but let me tell you what happened during the British times. India has a lot of experience of biopiracy. And during the British Raj, 18th and 19th century, India experienced the worst famines in its history. Over 65 million people died during the time the British ruled the country. In the 18th and 19th century, over 65 million people died. Of course, India had had famines before, and all countries have had famines or scarcity of food. But those 2 centuries, 18th and 19th century, were the very worst. I'll give you one little example why it happened. Because there is here, land is not just land, what use it's put to is very important. And who puts what use it's put to by whom? Who owns the land? Very crucial. India had a zamindari system, feudal system. And so, and then they have colonialism. So one of the things that the British did, and particularly in the 2 provinces that they occupy, the province of Bengal and Bihar, they started producing opium. Lot of land was taken away from production of rice and wheat, which was the staple food for the people. And they were forced to produce poppies for producing opium in the 19th century. Now, I don't know how many of you know the history here. There were 2 opium wars with China. And 1839 to 42, and then again in 1850s. Now here is a country, it's the only country, I think only after Taliban was the next one in Afghanistan, which was pushing drugs as a part of free trade. And there were 2 wars that occurred. And what had happened is it's the Indian soldiers fighting on behalf of the British against the Chinese to push opium to the Chinese. So this is what did it mean? It means there were a lot of cash crops. The land was not being produced, being used for what was required for staple food, rice and wheat, but a cash crop, cotton, which was needed for the Industrial Revolution back in Manchester. And what was also indigo for dyes for the cloth, and also tea later on. And then you have opium. So this is a very important factor in the life of the country. And not only the people, the cash crops, but so many people were moved out of India by the British as indentured labor. Again, you may recall that it was in 1831 that slave trade was banned all over the world. But that didn't mean that you couldn't still do some hanky-panky. So what happened is, they didn't call it slave trade, they call it indentured labor. So literally millions of people were moved out of India to Trinidad, Jamaica, to Fiji Island, to Mauritius, to Guyana, British Guyana. These were people taken there to work on sugar plantations. So it's a history of a country is very much steeped in what was done to its land, to its people. Now, it's not to say that the people, the Indian feudal systems did not exploit its people. That too went on for a long time. But it becomes very crucial what is done to the land, who owns the land, and what is grown on the land. We again in the United States, perhaps there's not much sympathy for certain things that happened in the revolutions in the 20th century, whether that revolution was in Russia, or in China, or in Vietnam, or in other countries, but these were revolutions to do with land. Who owns the land? And these are land, and so sometimes awful things happened, as under Stalin or under Mao in the 1950s, but nevertheless, these were the issues to do with land. What is going to be produced, who owns the land. So I think it's good to just keep that in mind. I've got to move on. Now this is again little Indian agriculture. So many women are involved in Indian agriculture. I said 50% of the workforce in India is engaged in agriculture. Of this, close to 65% are women. Also a lot of children. And so that means already what is the status of women, what education, what healthcare, and so on becomes crucial in terms of the rate of birth, etc. And here on the right side, India is now, after the Green Revolution that was introduced in India in the 1960s, becoming produces enough rice, enough wheat, enough fruit, vegetables in a way to feed the country. That does not mean, as everybody has said many a time, that everybody gets it. The distribution is always a growing problem. Not everybody has the money to buy food, not enough money to buy food, or good quality food, and so on. So these are issues that we face it here. Last night I saw the film Food, shocking film, and if you have not seen it, you would want to see it, how food is, what we do to the food in this country and the world over. Okay, now these are issues that have also been discussed in Indian popular culture. You know, sometimes we too much refer to the papers, academic papers people have written. But academic papers are often read by 3 people, including one's mother. But these things go to a lot of people who see the issues, what issues are. This film here, made in 1950s by a director, a Muslim director, Mehboob, and a communist director, leftist, about Mother India, a story of exploitation by the landlords, by the money lenders, and what happens that they lose their oxen, and now this woman here in the picture, you see her, she is working like a bull, and her 2 sons. The story is told in a popular style, but that's how literature, popular culture is. Popular culture is, but nevertheless it was a film that touched the hearts and minds of millions of people, and really for the first time, I think, for the first time made them aware that these are questions, that's where they're on. And again, many other novels and plays have been on this topic. This one on the nectar and sieve, if you don't know, it's the first time I read it, it really told me what it means to be hungry. What it means to be hungry, and she describes in about half a page the pangs of hunger. Now, I have never experienced hunger. I don't know how many people have really experienced hunger here. Fasting for a day or 2 is something different. But hunger, and not knowing you're going to get food next day or 2 or 3 or so. And this novel, written by a woman from South India, Nectar and Sieve, a remarkable short little book. And then the famous novel Godan, by a great Indian Hindi writer, Munshi Premchand, and so on. There are many. It's a popular culture has really tried to present some of these issues in a manner it reaches more people than our academic studies ever do. And this is, in some ways, I feel that is of a tragedy of our scholars, that we do not make enough effort to reach out to the people, to make issues available to them so that they can understand it better in a manner so some action can take place. Okay, here is another film, Dobi Ghazameen, 1950s, and what happened to the land. It's the land-based issues. Now, again, as I said, so many women are involved in the making of the agriculture, in the agriculture production at all levels. It's processing, it's transportation. What's different, which is different, that people who produce food in India, and by the time it gets to the consumer, in the retail